Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not in youth, but in the quiet autumn of life, when two weathered hearts recognize something sacred in each other. It's never too late to discover that the person you were meant to love has been waiting for you all along. Bjorn the Bear-Hearted was once a feared Viking warrior who terrorized distant shores. Now he lives alone in a remote Norwegian valley, believing his story has ended. Then a caravan crashes near his land during a harsh winter. From the wreckage, he pulls out Freya, a woman running from a clan war she refuses to fight. As the snows trap them together, something unexpected happens between the aging warrior and the fierce woman half his age. But when Freya's enemies find them, Bjorn faces his greatest battle. Can love truly conquer all, even when death comes calling? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like the breath of sleeping gods, wrapping around Bjorn's modest timber hall with the familiar embrace he'd known for 20 winters. At 63, his massive frame still filled doorways, though silver now threaded through the auburn beard that had once struck terror into Saxon hearts. The warhammer hanging above his stone hearth caught the first light filtering through the smoke hole, a weapon that had crushed shields and split skulls from Ireland to Constantinople. Now it gathered dust, a monument to violence he'd grown weary of remembering. Bjorn's calloused hands, scarred from countless battles, moved with surprising gentleness as he fed kindling to the dying embers. The ritual had become sacred to him. Wake before dawn, stoke the fire, prepare simple porridge, and step outside to greet the day his wife Astrid would never see. In the wooden box beside his sleeping furs lay her wedding ring, a simple band of hammered silver he'd crafted during their first winter together. Some mornings he held it, feeling the weight of promises kept and those he'd failed to honor. Today, like most days, he left it untouched. The valley stretched before him in pristine silence, a bowl of white carved between towering peaks that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. His longhouse sat on elevated ground, commanding views of the narrow pass that served as the only entrance to this hidden sanctuary. Below, a frozen stream wound through stands of pine and birch, their branches heavy with snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the strengthening light. It was beautiful in a way that sometimes hurt, too peaceful for a man whose dreams still echoed with the clash of steel and the screams of dying men. 23 years had passed since his last raid. 23 years since he'd stood on the deck of Seawolf, his dragon-prowed longship, and felt the intoxicating surge of power that came with commanding 40 of the fiercest warriors to ever grip an axe. They'd called him Bear-Hearted then, not for his size alone, but for the way he fought, methodical, relentless, impossible to stop once roused to anger. Kings had paid him tribute. Monks had prayed for deliverance from his coming. Songs had been composed about his exploits, though he doubted anyone still sang them. The transformation had begun with Astrid. He'd taken her as a prize from a coastal settlement in what the Christians called Northumbria, expecting nothing more than a bedwarmer for the winter months. Instead, she'd become the anchor that pulled him from the storm of his own nature. Small and fierce, with eyes the color of summer sky, she'd refused to be broken by captivity. When he'd ordered her to serve his ale, she'd thrown the drinking horn at his head. When he'd laughed at her defiance, she'd grabbed the kitchen knife and nearly opened his throat. But it was what she'd said afterward that changed everything. You want a slave? Take one. You want a woman? Earn one. The courtship that followed had lasted 3 years of raids growing shorter, winters growing longer, and a gradual recognition that the hunger driving him across dark seas had nothing to do with gold or glory. Astrid saw through the legend to the man beneath, the younger son of a minor jarl who'd chosen the sword because words had never come easily. She taught him that strength could protect instead of destroy, that a man's worth wasn't measured in enemies slain, but in the peace he could create. Their marriage had lasted 15 years. 15 years of contentment he'd never imagined possible. Tending their small plot of land, raising sheep and goats, hosting the occasional traveler with stories from the wider world. Astrid had wanted children, and they'd tried, but the gods had other plans. Perhaps it was for the best. Bjorn's blood ran too hot, carried too much violence. He'd feared what kind of father a man with his history might make. The sickness had taken her during their 16th winter together. A fever that began as a simple cough and spread through her lungs like wildfire through dry grass. Bjorn had held her hand as she died, promising to find her in Valhalla or whatever realm awaited women of such courage. Her last words had been a whisper he still strained to understand. Live for something more than memory. That had been 8 winters ago. 8 winters of solitude broken only by visits from Olaf the merchant, who brought supplies twice yearly, and a handful of villagers. From Haugen, a settlement 2 days' walk through the southern pass. They respected him, these simple folk farmers and craftsmen who needed protection from bandits and wild animals. They brought him smoked meat and warm wool in exchange for his vigilance, though none had ever seen him raise a weapon in anger. The Bjorn they knew was a quiet giant who mended fences and carved chess pieces from seasoned oak, whose greatest excitement came from solving disputes over boundary stones and straying livestock. But sometimes, when the wind blew from the west, he caught the salt tang of distant seas and felt the old restlessness stirring. Sometimes he stood before the warhammer and remembered what it felt like to be feared, to command, to matter in ways that extended beyond this peaceful valley. Those were dangerous moments when the civilized man Astrid had helped him become warred with the berserker who still lived in his bones. The sound of distant bells carried on the morning air, not church bells, for there were no Christians this far from settled lands, but the small bronze chimes the merchants tied to their pack animals. Bjorn's weathered face creased into something approaching a smile. Olaf must have made good time through the mountain passes, despite the early winter storms that had been battering the region for weeks. The old trader was dependable as sunrise, arriving each fall with news from the wider world and goods that made life more bearable. Salt for preserving meat, iron for tools. Occasionally, a jug of mead strong enough to warm bones numbed by mountain cold. He pulled on his thick wool cloak and stepped outside, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The bells grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of hooves on packed snow and the jingle of harnessed leather. But something was wrong. The sounds came from the North Pass, not the southern route Olaf always used. The northern way was treacherous, even in good weather, barely wide enough for a single horse and blocked by rock slides more often than not. Bjorn's warrior instincts, dormant for decades but never truly dead, began to wake. His hand moved unconsciously to his belt, finding only the utility knife he used for daily tasks. Whatever approached his valley was either desperate or foolish, possibly both. He retreated into his hall long enough to retrieve a long-handled axe, not his old battle axe, which hung beside the warhammer like a museum piece, but a practical tool for splitting wood that could serve as a weapon if necessary. The first figures emerged from the tree line as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. A caravan of perhaps a dozen people, their pack animals struggling through snow that reached their bellies. Even at distance, Bjorn could see they were in poor condition, clothes torn, movement sluggish with exhaustion and cold. They'd obviously been traveling for days, possibly weeks, through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain folk. As they drew closer, details became clearer. Most were men, bearded and armed in the style of Jarl's household guards, their shields bearing symbols Bjorn didn't recognize. At their center rode a figure wrapped in furs and seated on a beymar that picked its way carefully through the drifts. Something about the rider's posture suggested nobility straight-backed despite obvious fatigue. Head held high even in obvious distress. The lead rider spotted Bjorn and raised his hand in greeting. The universal gesture of peaceful intent, though Bjorn noted the man's other hand remained near his sword hilt. These people were afraid, running from something that had driven them into the wilderness during the worst weather of the year. "Hail, friend," the man called in accented Norse as the group approached. "Are you the one they call Bear-Hearted?" Bjorn felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. That name belonged to a different man, a different life. Few people still living knew it. Fewer still would use it so casually. "I am Bjorn," he replied carefully. "This is my land." The rider dismounted stiffly, favoring his left leg. Now Bjorn could see he was younger than he'd first appeared, perhaps 35, with the kind of neat beard that suggested regular access to mirrors and sharp knives. His cloak was good wool, his sword well maintained, his manner that of a man accustomed to command. "I am Hakon Eriksson," he said with a slight bow. "We seek sanctuary, Lord. Our lady is gravely injured, and we've nowhere else to turn." Bjorn's gaze moved to the central figure, still mounted and swaying slightly in the saddle. The furs had shifted, revealing a pale face framed by dark hair. A woman, as he'd suspected, though her features were sharp with pain and exhaustion. Even in her current state, there was something striking about her, a quality of controlled strength that reminded him unexpectedly of Astrid. Sanctuary from what? Bjorn asked. Hakon exchanged glances with his companions before answering. Clan. War. Blood feud. The kind of thing that follows a man no matter how far he runs. Or a woman, Bjorn thought, understanding beginning to dawn. The injured figure was no mere passenger, but the reason for their flight, valuable enough to protect, dangerous enough to flee with through deadly terrain. He'd been in similar situations himself, long ago, when political necessity made heroes of some and outlaws of others. The woman spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse but clear. "We ask nothing but shelter until I can travel again. We have silver to pay for your trouble." There was pride in her tone, and pain held rigidly in check. Bjorn recognized both qualities. They were familiar companions from his own past. The smart thing would be to refuse, to send them back the way they'd come before whatever pursued them arrived at his doorstep. He built his peace carefully, stone by stone, year by year. Wise men didn't gamble it on strangers bearing obvious trouble. But as he looked at the woman struggling to remain upright in her saddle, as he saw the exhaustion and fear hidden behind her guard's stoic expressions, he remembered Astrid's last words. Live for something more than memory. Perhaps this was what she'd meant, not the endless repetition of familiar routines, but the willingness to take risks for something beyond his own comfort. "Come inside," he said finally. "All of you. We'll sort out payment later." The relief on their faces was immediately visible, though they tried to hide it. These were proud people, accustomed to giving rather than receiving aid. As they began to dismount and gather their belongings, Bjorn wondered what he'd just invited into his carefully ordered world. Whatever it was, he suspected it would change everything. The woman needed help getting down from her horse, though she tried to hide it. When Bjorn stepped forward to assist her, their eyes met for the first time. Hers were gray as storm clouds, filled with intelligence and a wariness born of experience. She couldn't be more than 35, perhaps less, but something in her gaze spoke of trials that aged the soul faster than years. "I can manage," she said softly. "I'm sure you can," Bjorn replied. "But you don't have to." For a moment longer their eyes held, some wordless communication passing between them that neither quite understood. Then she nodded slightly and allowed him to help her to the ground. She was lighter than he'd expected, and he realized with growing concern that she was likely more injured than she appeared. as they moved toward his hall. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would close the passes for days, perhaps weeks. Whatever had driven these people to his valley, whenever they were running from, it would have to wait. Winter had made its own decision about their immediate future. The storm struck with the fury of angry gods, transforming Bjorn's peaceful valley into a howling maze of white death. What had begun as gentle snowfall while the travelers warmed themselves around his hearth became a blizzard that shook the very timbers of his hall. The wind screamed through gaps in the stone foundation, and even the great fire Bjorn had built seemed to cower before the elemental rage outside. Freya, she had given her name, quietly while her guards tended their horses and his small stable sat, wrapped in thick furs near the fire, her face pale but determined. The journey had clearly taken its toll. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she moved with the careful precision of someone fighting pain with every breath. Yet she maintained a regal bearing that spoke of noble birth and iron will. Her guards clustered near the door, hands never far from their weapons despite the obvious safety of Bjorn's hall. They were good men. Bjorn could see loyal, competent, but carrying the weight of some terrible failure. Hakon Eriksson had introduced them briefly. Tormund the Grey, an older warrior whose scar spoke of countless battles. Eric Bloodhair, a younger man with the quick eyes of a natural scout. And Magnus Stonefist, broad-shouldered and quiet, who watched Freya with the devotion of a faithful hound. "You travel far from the settled lands," Bjorn observed, offering Freya a horn of warm mead. His hands, he noticed, were steadier than they had any right to be given the circumstances. Few caravans risk the mountain passes this late in the season. Freya accepted the drink with a nod of thanks. Sometimes circumstances leave little choice in timing. Her voice carried the educated accent of jarls and kings, confirming Bjorn's suspicions about her birth. But there was something else, a careful neutrality that suggested long practice or revealing nothing of importance. He recognized the skill. He'd possessed it himself during the years when saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could mean death. "The storm will last at least 2 days," Bjorn said, settling onto a low stool across from her. "Possibly longer. You're welcome to stay until the pass is clear." "You're generous to strangers," Tormund spoke from his position by the door. "In our experience, such generosity often comes with a price." Bjorn met the older warrior's gaze steadily. "In my experience, a man who turns away travelers in a storm usually finds himself traveling alone when he needs help most." It was an old saying, common enough, but something in Freya's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even approval. She studied Bjorn over the rim of her drinking horn with renewed interest. "You speak like a man who's known both sides of that bargain," she said. "I have." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Outside, the wind rose to a fresh crescendo, rattling the wooden shutters and sending snow spiraling down through the smoke hole to hiss against the firestones. Bjorn rose to add more fuel to the flames, using the movement to mask his study of his unexpected guests. They were afraid. That much was obvious despite their attempts to hide it. But this wasn't the simple fear of travelers caught in bad weather. This was the bone-deep terror of people who knew exactly what pursued them and understood their chances of escape. He'd seen it before, in his own reflection during the darker chapters of his youth. "Tell me about this clan war you're fleeing," he said quietly. The guards tensed immediately, hands moving the weapons. But Freya raised a hand, stopping them before they could react further. "What makes you think we're fleeing anything?" she asked. Bjorn smiled grimly. "Because I was young once. Young and dangerous and accustomed to being hunted. You don't take the northern pass in early winter unless something worse than weather is behind you." For a long moment, silence filled the hall except for the storm's fury. Then Freya sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "My clan has ancient grievances with the sons of Ragnar Grimson," she said finally. "Blood debts that go back 3 generations. I tried to negotiate peace, to end the cycle before it consumed everyone we cared about. Ragnar's response was to raid our lands and burn our hall. And now you run. Now I survive," she corrected sharply. "There's a difference." Bjorn nodded slowly. There was indeed a difference, one he understood better than she might expect. "How many men does Grimson command?" 200, maybe more," Hakon answered when Freya hesitated. "Professional warriors, not farmers with spears. They've been hunting us for 6 days. 6 days through mountain terrain and worsening weather, with only 4 guards to protect a high-value target. The mathematics of pursuit were simple and brutal. Even if Grimson's men had lost the trail temporarily, they would find it again once the storm passed. The northern pass left only one route of escape, and patient hunters could simply wait at the far end. "They'll find you here," Bjorn said matter-of-factly. "We know." Freya's voice was steady, but he caught the slight tremor in her hands as she raised the drinking horn. "We're hoping the storm will delay them long enough for me to recover some strength. A few more days, and we might reach the sea. There are ships." She stopped abruptly, realizing she'd revealed more than intended. But Bjorn was already shaking his head. "The eastern pass is blocked," he said. "Rockslide took it out 2 weeks ago. Won't be clear until spring." The silence that followed was profound. Even the storm seemed to quiet momentarily, as if the elements themselves recognized the weight of this revelation. Freya closed her eyes, and for the first time since her arrival, her composure cracked slightly. "Then we're trapped," Magnus said flatly. "No," Bjorn replied, surprising them all. "You're safe." The guards looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. Tormund actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Against 200 men? With respect, friend, you may be bare-hearted, but even legends have limits." Bjorn's expression didn't change. "You know that name." "Every warrior north of the fjords knows that name," Eric said quietly. "The question is whether the man still lives up to it." For a heartbeat, the years fell away. Bjorn felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the slow burn that had once made him the most feared raider on the Whale Road. The warhammer above his hearth seemed to pulse with remembered weight, and he could almost taste the salt spray of distant battles. Then the moment passed, leaving him once again an aging man in a simple hall, far from the glories and horrors of his youth. "The man who earned that name died with his wife," he said quietly, "but the knowledge remains." Freya was watching him intently now, her gray eyes searching his face as if trying to read the secrets written in his scars. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You mean to fight them?" "I mean to protect what's mine. This valley, this hall, their sanctuary. Any who seek shelter here will find it, regardless of who comes hunting." It was more than bravado, though his guests had no way of knowing that. Bjorn had spent 20 years learning every stone, every tree, every defensible position in his domain. He knew where the ice was thinnest on the stream, which paths became impassable in snow, how sound carried between the peaks. An army might command superior numbers, but this was his ground. "You don't understand," Freya said urgently. "Ragnar Grimson isn't some petty raider. He's cunning, ruthless. His men are veterans of campaigns from Ireland to the eastern seas. They'll burn this place around our ears and count it a small victory. Let them try." The quiet certainty in his voice gave them all pause. This wasn't the boast of a young warrior seeking glory, but the measured assessment of a man who'd survived countless battles by understanding exactly what he could and couldn't accomplish. Outside, something heavy struck the side of the hall, branch torn loose by the wind, or perhaps part of the stable roof. The sound made everyone tense, hands moving to weapons before rational thought could intervene. They were all wound tight as bowstrings, expecting attack at any moment despite the obvious impossibility of anyone moving through the current storm. "We should rest," Bjorn said, rising from his stool. "Tomorrow we'll know better what we're facing." But as his guests settled into the sleeping furs he provided, Bjorn remained by the fire long into the night. In the flames, he saw faces from his past warriors he'd fought beside and against, the burned halls of enemies, the blood-soaked beaches where he'd made his reputation. All of it seemed very far away and impossibly recent at the same time. Astrid's wedding ring lay in its wooden box beside his sleeping place, catching occasional glints of firelight. He'd built this peaceful life for her, sustained it in her memory. Now circumstances demanded he'd risk it all for strangers whose presence had already shattered the careful isolation he'd maintained for 8 years. But as he glanced at Freya's sleeping form, seeing the strength that persisted even in vulnerability, he found himself thinking not of what he might lose, but of what he might gain. For the first time since Astrid's death, the future held possibilities beyond mere survival. The storm raged on, sealing them all together in the warm circle of firelight, while somewhere in the swirling darkness beyond, death rode closer with every passing hour. Dawn brought an eerie silence that was somehow more ominous than the storm's fury. Bjorn woke to find the world outside transformed into a crystalline wasteland, with snow drifted halfway up his windows and icicles hanging like spears from the eaves. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a landscape that would challenge even the most determined pursuit. Freya was already awake when he emerged from his sleeping alcove, sitting upright against the wall with her furs pulled tight around her shoulders. Her face was flushed with fever, and he could see the careful way she breathed shallow, controlled, fighting against pain that threatened to overwhelm her composure. "You're hurt worse than you let on," he said quietly, not wanting to wake her. "Guards, it's nothing that won't heal with time." Her voice was hoarse, but steady. Bjorn studied her with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen countless battlefield injuries. The way she favored her left side, the slight tremor in her hands, the pallor that spoke of blood loss, these weren't the marks of simple exhaustion. "Show me," he said. "I'm fine. Show me, or I'll wake Hacken and have him hold you down while I look anyway." The threat was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that Freya blinked in surprise. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, the first genuine expression of humor he'd seen from her. "You don't make idle threats, do you?" "Never saw the point." After a moment's hesitation, she pulled back her cloak to reveal a crude bandage wrapped around her ribs. The linen was stained dark with old blood, and Bjorn could smell the beginning taint of infection, even from several feet away. "Arrow wound," she said simply. 3 days ago. "The point's still in there somewhere." Bjorn's expression darkened. An untreated arrow wound in winter conditions was often a death sentence, especially if the arrowhead had been barbed or poisoned. That she'd managed to travel at all spoke to extraordinary willpower, but will alone wouldn't save her if the infection spread. "I'll need to clean it properly," he said. "It won't be pleasant. I've survived unpleasant before." He moved to a wooden chest in the corner of his hall, one of several that contained the accumulated wisdom of his long life. From it he withdrew a collection of items that would have surprised anyone who knew only his reputation as a warrior. Smooth river stones, warm glass smoothed by centuries of water, dried herbs in carefully labeled pouches, bone needles, and silk. Thread finer than anything typically found in mountain halls. "My mother was a healer," he explained, noting Freya's curious expression. "She taught me that knowing how to preserve life was as important as knowing how to take it." The healing stones had been passed down through 5 generations of women. In his family, mothers and grandmothers who tended wounds and birthed children and kept the ancient knowledge alive through times of war and peace. His mother had been reluctant to teach such skills to a son destined for the warrior's path, but Bjorn had shown an aptitude for the healing arts that couldn't be ignored. "These stones hold heat longer than metal," he explained, setting several near the fire to warm. "They'll help draw out the infection without burning the flesh." While the stones heated, he prepared a mixture of herbs, willow bark for pain, honey for its cleansing properties, and yarrow to slow bleeding. The familiar routine calmed his mind, connecting him to memories of his mother's gentle hands and patient voice as she taught him the mysteries of healing. "You'll need to remove your shirt," he said without looking at her. "My guards are still asleep. And even if they weren't, I'm old enough to be your father. This is about keeping you alive, not satisfying curiosity." Freya studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. With obvious effort, she began to work the heavy wool garment over her head, wincing as the movement pulled at her injury. Bjorn moved to help her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he eased the fabric away from the wound. The injury was worse than he'd feared. The arrow had taken her high on the left side, just below the ribs, and the crude field dressing had done little more than slow the bleeding. The flesh around the wound was angry red, radiating heat that spoke of deep infection. Worse, he could see the dark outline of the arrowhead still buried in her muscle. "This should have been treated immediately," he said grimly. "We didn't have time to stop." Grimson's men were too close. Bjorn said nothing, but he understood. He'd made similar calculations in his youth, weighing immediate survival against long-term consequences, choosing to endure pain rather than risk capture. The mathematics of desperation were always brutal. He worked in silence, using warm water to clean away the old bandages and dried blood. Freya bore the discomfort without complaint, though he could see the effort it cost her in the tight lines around her eyes and the way her hands clenched into fists. "The arrowhead has to come out," he said finally. "Can you do it?" "Yes, but it'll hurt worse than anything you've felt so far." "Worse than watching my home burn? Worse than seeing good men die for my mistakes?" Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of recent trauma. "I doubt it." Bjorn met her eyes, seeing in them a pain that went far deeper than any physical wound. "Tell me what happened." As he began the delicate work of probing for the arrowhead, Freya spoke in a voice carefully drained of emotion. She told him of the peace negotiations that had taken months to arrange, of her belief that reasonable people could find alternatives to endless bloodshed. She described the feast where everything had gone wrong, Ragnar Grimson's false smile as he'd accepted her terms, the signal that had brought armed men pouring into her hall, the desperate fighting that had allowed only a handful of her people to escape. "I was naive," she said as Bjorn's probe found the arrowhead buried deep in muscle. "I thought wanting peace was enough. I thought good intentions could overcome generations of hatred." "Peace isn't naive," Bjorn replied, concentrating on his work. "But trusting your enemies to want it as much as you do, that's dangerous." The arrowhead was barbed, designed to cause maximum damage coming out. Bjorn had seen similar weapons before, crafted specifically for hunting high-value targets who might try to remove them hastily. Extracting it would require patience and skill, qualities that had often been in short supply on ancient battlefields. "Hold still," he warned, then began the careful process of working the point free. Freya's intake of breath was sharp, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she spoke through gritted teeth. "You sound like a man who's learned about trust the hard way." "I've been betrayed. I've betrayed others. In war, it's often the same thing." The arrowhead came free with a rush of blood and pus that confirmed Bjorn's fears about infection, but the wound was clean now, ready for proper treatment. He pressed one of the heated stones against the injury, drawing out the corruption, while Freya's back arched in silent agony. "Why are you helping me?" she gasped. Bjorn paused in his work, considering the question. Why was he risking everything for a stranger who'd brought nothing but trouble to his doorstep? The answer, when it came, surprised him with its simplicity. Because you remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who believed the world could be better than it was. Your wife? Astrid. Yes. He applied the herbal mixture to her wound, then began wrapping it with clean linen. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind was elsewhere, remembering another woman who'd faced impossible odds with quiet courage, who'd seen possibilities where others saw only problems. She must have been remarkable, Freya said softly. She was. She saw something in me worth saving, even when I couldn't see it myself. The bandage was secure now, professional work that would give the wound its best chance to heal cleanly. Freya tested the binding carefully, surprised by how much better she felt already. Thank you, she said. For this and for the sanctuary, we'll leave as soon as the pass is clear. Will you? Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. What? Do you mean? I mean, winter is just beginning. The passes won't be reliably clear for months, and Grimson's men will be watching every route, waiting for spring to make their move. The implications settled between them like stones dropped into still water. Freya would be trapped here until spring trapped with a man whose reputation suggested he was as dangerous as those hunting her, in a valley that could become either sanctuary or prison, depending on choices neither of them had yet made. Months, she repeated quietly. Months, Bjorn confirmed. Long enough to heal properly. Long enough to plan what comes next. Long enough for many things. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment both of them felt the first stirring of something that had nothing to do with sanctuary or protection or simple obligations of hospitality. It was dangerous. This recognition dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with pursuing armies or winter storms. Outside, the wind was beginning to rise again, promising another night of isolation. But inside the hall, by the warm fire with the healing stones cooling beside them, two people who'd thought their stories were ending began to suspect. They might be mistaken. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised them all with its naturalness. Freya's fever broke on the third morning, and with it came a restless energy that made her a poor patient. Despite Bjorn's stern warnings about letting her wound heal properly, she insisted on helping with the daily tasks that kept his household. Functioning through the harsh mountain winter she proved surprisingly capable for someone of noble birth. Her hands knew their way around a loom, and she mended torn clothing with neat, efficient stitches that spoke of practical experience rather than mere ornamental learning. When Bjorn brought in firewood, she was there to stack it properly for seasoning. When he prepared meals, she worked beside him with the easy competence of someone accustomed to taking care of herself. Most Jarl's daughters I've known wouldn't soil their hands with such work. Bjorn observed one morning as they prepared porridge together. Most Jarl's daughters haven't spent the last 5 years managing a household under siege, Freya replied, stirring the pot with steady motions that kept the grain from sticking. When half your people are dead or fled, you learn to do what needs doing. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd adapted to circumstances beyond her control. Bjorn found himself studying her profile as she worked the determined set of her jaw, the way she unconsciously favored her injured side, the careful economy of movement that spoke of someone always aware of her. Limitations that her guards had gradually relaxed their vigilance as the days passed without sign of pursuit. The storm had been followed by 2 more smaller squalls that kept the passes impassable and made tracking impossible. Tormund the Grey spent his time maintaining weapons and gear with the methodical patience of a veteran campaigner. Eric Bloodhair scouted the immediate area whenever weather permitted, learning the terrain with professional thoroughness. Magnus Stonefist, the youngest of the 3, helped Bjorn with the heavier work around the compound chopping wood, tending animals, reinforcing the stable against winter winds. But it was during the evening hours that the real connections began to form. With darkness falling early and little to do but wait for spring, they gathered around Bjorn's fire and shared the stories that defined them. Tormund spoke of campaigns fought from the Orkney Islands to the rivers of Russia, his weathered voice bringing distant battles to life with precise detail. Eric told hunting stories from his youth in the northern forests, tales of tracking wolves and bears through terrain that would challenge even experienced woodsmen. Magnus, despite his nickname, proved surprisingly gentle, a man whose strength had been earned through necessity rather than choice. He'd been a blacksmith before clan warfare had claimed his village, and he spoke with quiet passion about the craft of shaping metal into tools and weapons. His massive hands, scarred from forge work and battle, moved with unexpected delicacy. When he helped Freya adjust her bandages or reposition logs on the fire, Freya herself was a revelation. During these quiet hours, away from the immediate pressures of survival, her natural intelligence emerged like sunlight breaking through clouds. She spoke 3 languages fluently, had read the sagas of distant lands, and possessed a strategic mind that impressed even Bjorn with its clarity. When they discussed the political situations that had led to her current predicament, she demonstrated an understanding of power and its complexities that rivaled any jarl he'd known. "The old ways are dying," she said one evening as wind howled outside the hall. "Not just here, but everywhere. The world is getting smaller, more connected. Clan feuds that once could burn for generations now attract attention from kings and emperors who see opportunity in our divisions." "You think that's why Grimson betrayed your peace negotiations?" Bjorn asked. "I know it is. He's already made overtures to Harald Fairhair's court, a unified clan under his leadership, claiming ancient grievances against my family. It gives Harald justification to intervene. My death becomes a legal pretext for expanding royal authority." Bjorn nodded slowly. He'd seen similar patterns during his raiding years, the way local conflicts became pieces in larger games played by distant powers. It was one reason he'd eventually grown weary of warfare, the realization that individual courage and honor meant little when weighed against political calculation. "So you're not just running from Grimson," he said. "You're running from a future that's already been decided." "Was decided," Freya corrected. "Past tense. I've had time to think while recovering here, and I'm beginning to see other possibilities." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. There was a quality in her expression he hadn't seen before, not hope exactly, but a kind of focused determination that reminded him of himself planning particularly complex raids. "What kind of possibilities?" But before she could answer, Magnus shifted uncomfortably near the fire. "My lady," he said quietly, "perhaps some thoughts are better kept private." The warning was gentle but clear, and Freya nodded acknowledgement. But her eyes remained on Bjorn's face, and he sensed there were conversations waiting to happen when they could speak without audience. The opportunity came 2 days later, when a brief break in the weather allowed the guards to venture out for hunting and scouting. Freya had been restless all morning, moving carefully around the hall like a caged wolf, testing the boundaries of her pen. When the men left to check snares, Bjorn had set along the stream. She turned to him with obvious relief. "Walk with me," she said. "Please. These walls are beginning to feel smaller every day." They stepped outside into air so cold it burned the lungs, but after days confined indoors, even the harsh mountain climate felt like freedom. Snow crunched beneath their feet as they made their way to a sheltered spot overlooking the valley's southern approach. The view was magnificent white peaks stretching to the horizon like frozen waves, their surfaces catching the pale winter sunlight in brilliant displays of crystal and shadow. "It's beautiful here," Freya said, pulling her cloak tighter against the wind. "I can see why you chose it." "Astrid chose it," Bjorn corrected. I was ready to keep traveling, keep running from whatever was behind us. She saw this place and said it felt like home. You still miss her every day, but the missing has changed over the years. At first, it was like a wound that wouldn't heal. Now it's more like, he paused, searching for words. Like a song you remember loving, but can't quite recall all the words to. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds gather around the distant peaks. Finally, Freya spoke again. The possibilities I mentioned, they involve you. Bjorn turned to study her profile. How so? Grimson expects me to run, to keep running until exhaustion or winter or his men finally catch up. He's planned for pursuit, for siege, for all the conventional responses to overwhelming force. But he hasn't planned for what happens if I stop running and start thinking like the tactician my father trained me to be. And what does that tactician see? Freya's smile was sharp as a blade. She sees that sometimes the best defense isn't running or hiding. Sometimes it's making the enemy come to you on ground of your choosing, with all eyes they don't know you have. Understanding began to dawn, along with a mixture of admiration and concern. You want to make a stand here. I want to end this, she corrected. Not just survive it, but finish it in a way that serves something larger than mere revenge. Grimson has maybe 200 men, but they're spread across a dozen raiding parties searching the mountains. If we could eliminate enough of them. You're talking about war, Bjorn interrupted. Real war, not the kind of skirmish that's kept your clans busy for generations. I'm talking about the kind of strategic thinking that built your reputation. Bear-hearted. The kind that could turn a handful of defenders into something Grimson's army couldn't ignore or dismiss. She turned to face him fully, and he saw in her eyes the same quality that had once driven him across hostile seas. The absolute certainty that impossible odds could be overcome through superior planning and will. You want me to become a warlord. Again, I want you to become whatever it takes to win. For both of us. The words hung between them in the cold air, heavy with implication. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound both wild and lonely that seemed to echo the choices they faced. Bjorn felt the familiar stirring in his blood, the old hunger for challenge and conflict that he'd thought safely buried with his past. But when he looked at Freya, at the hope and determination and barely concealed desperation in her face, he realized that some hungers were stronger than others. Some promises mattered more than the comfort of a peaceful grave. We should go back, he said finally. Your guards will worry if we're gone too long. But as they walked back toward his hall, neither spoke of the real worry that they were both beginning to want things that could only be won through blood, sacrifice, and the kind of calculated violence that had once made Bjorn the most feared man on the northern seas, hidden in the inner pocket of Freya's cloak, wrapped carefully in oiled leather, lay the small dagger she'd carried since girlhood, a weapon her father had given her with the words, "Trust carefully, but always be prepared for betrayal." She'd kept it secret from even her most loyal guards, a reminder that survival sometimes required keeping certain capabilities hidden until the moment they were needed. Now, as she walked beside this aging warrior who'd shown her more genuine kindness than she'd known in years, she wondered if the time for secrets was finally ending. The blade was sharp enough to slip between ribs if necessary, but increasingly, she found herself hoping it might serve a different purpose cutting through the careful walls they both built around hearts that had learned to expect disappointment. Some weapons, she reflected, were more dangerous to those who carried them than to any enemy they might face. Winter settled over the valley with the patience of a siege engine, each day bringing deeper cold and higher drifts that transformed Bjorn's sanctuary into something resembling the edge of the world. By the time the solstice passed, the isolation was complete, no tracks led in or out of the valley, and even the hardiest traveler would think twice about attempting the passes until spring's first thaw. it was during these deepest, darkest weeks that Bjorn brought out his chess set. He'd carved the pieces himself during his early years in the valley, when winter nights had stretched endlessly and his hands had needed work to keep his mind from darker thoughts. The board was a masterwork of patient craftsmanship, 64 squares cut from alternating light and dark wood, polished smooth by years of use. The pieces themselves were works of art, kings and queens with faces that seemed almost alive, knights mounted on rearing horses so detailed you could see the individual links of their bridles, castles that looked capable of withstanding real sieges. My father taught me to play, Freya said the first evening he set the board between them. He said chess was war without the screaming. Wise man, Bjorn replied, arranging the pieces with the reverence of ritual. What did he teach you about strategy? That the most important battles are won before the first piece moves. That patience is a weapon more valuable than any sword. And that sometimes the only way to save your king is to sacrifice everything else. They played in the warm circle of firelight while her guards dozed or worked quietly on their gear. The first game was tentative, each testing the other's style and skill. Freya played with the calculated aggression of someone trained in formal strategy, developing her pieces efficiently and maintaining strong defensive positions. Bjorn's approach was more intuitive, seemingly random moves that gradually revealed themselves as part of a larger pattern. You don't play like any opponent I've faced, Freya observed as her carefully constructed defense began to crumble under pressure she couldn't quite identify. Most chess masters learn from books or other masters, Bjorn replied, sliding a knight into position that threatened 3 of her pieces simultaneously. I learned from war. Real war teaches you that sometimes the best move is the one your enemy considers impossible. She studied the board with growing admiration and frustration. His position looked chaotic, almost random, but every piece served multiple purposes. Her attempt to punish what she'd thought was sloppy development had instead walked into a trap she was only now beginning to understand. Checkmate in 4 moves, she said finally, tipping over her king in acknowledgement. 5, actually, but close enough. Show me. He demonstrated the sequence that would have led to her inevitable defeat, his scarred hands moving the pieces with gentle precision. Freya watched intently, memorizing not just the moves, but the thinking behind them. This wasn't mere tactical skill. It was the strategic genius that had once made him legendary. Another game? She asked. They played 3 more that night, and Freya lost them all. But each defeat taught her something new about the man across from her. He thought in layers, planning not just his own moves, but anticipating her responses to his responses. He was patient in ways that went beyond mere waiting, willing to sacrifice temporary advantages for long-term position. Most importantly, he understood that the appearance of weakness could be as valuable as actual strength. You're holding back, she said after the 4th game. How do you mean? You could have checkmated me in the 2nd game after only 12 moves. Instead, you let it continue for 37. You're teaching, not just playing. Bjorn smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features in unexpected ways. Astrid used to say the same thing. She claimed I was incapable of playing anything at full strength if I thought my opponent could learn something from losing. Was she right? Usually. He began setting up the pieces for another game, but she also said it was one of the reasons. She fell in love with me. Apparently, there aren't many warriors who care more about making their enemies stronger than about proving their own superiority. The comment hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings neither was quite ready to address directly. Freya concentrated on arranging her pieces, but she was acutely aware of Bjorn's presence across the small table, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the careful way he handled the carved figures, the occasional glance that lasted just slightly, longer than strategy required. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "About how you met." Bjorn's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. It's not a pleasant story. The best ones rarely are. He was quiet for so long that Freya thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets. "I took her in a raid. She was 16, daughter of a Saxon thane who'd refused to pay tribute. My men burned her father's hall and killed anyone who resisted. Standard procedure for someone who defied us twice." Freya said nothing, but she didn't look away. Whatever judgment her expression might have held was hidden in the shifting firelight. "She should have been terrified," Bjorn continued. "Should have begged or wept or tried to buy her life with whatever valuable she could offer. Instead, she looked at me like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe and asked if I was proud of myself. What did you say?" I laughed. It seemed absurd. This slip of a girl lecturing the Bear-Hearted about honor. But then she kept talking, and I realized she wasn't afraid because she'd already lost everything that mattered to her. Her father, her brothers, her home all gone. What could I do to her that life hadn't already done? He moved his first pawn, a simple opening that could develop in a dozen different directions. The original plan was to sell her in the slave markets at Dublin. Good money for a young woman of noble birth, especially one who could read and write. But during the voyage back to our ships, she started asking questions. What kind of questions? The kind that made me uncomfortable. About why we did what we did. Whether we ever thought about the families we destroyed, the children we orphaned. Whether any of us had ever tried to build something instead of just taking what others had built. Freya made her own opening move, then settled back to listen. This was more than Bjorn had said about his past and all their previous conversations combined. By the time we reached Norway, I was having trouble sleeping, he continued. I kept thinking about those questions, about the look in her eyes when she'd asked them. Not accusing, exactly. More like she was genuinely curious about how a man becomes the kind of person who burns homes for a living. "So, you kept her." I told myself it was temporary, that I needed time to figure out why she bothered me so much. But weeks turned into months, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations more than anything else in my day. She had opinions about everything: politics, religion, the proper way to smoke fish. Most of them were completely wrong, of course. For the first time since beginning the story, Bjorn smiled with genuine warmth. But she made me think. Really think, not just react on instinct. And gradually, I started to see myself through her eyes. It wasn't a flattering reflection. They played in contemplative silence for several moves, each absorbed in thoughts that had little to do with chess. Finally, Freya spoke. "When did you know you loved her?" "The day she stopped trying to escape." I'd given her the run of my haul, figuring there was nowhere to go anyway. We were 100 miles from the nearest settlement, and winter was coming. But she'd still spent every day testing the boundaries, looking for weaknesses in my guard routines, gathering supplies for an escape attempt. Bjorn captured one of her pawns with a knight, but his attention was clearly elsewhere. Then, one morning I woke up, and she was making breakfast. Just like that, as if she belonged there. When I asked her why, she said she'd realized something important, which was that running away would just take her back to a world that had already destroyed everything she cared about. But staying meant she might be able to build something new, something better than what either of us had lost. Freya studied his face in the firelight, seeing past the scars and gray hair to the younger man who'd fallen in love with a captive, who'd chosen to see possibilities instead of limitations. "She sounds remarkable." She was. And stubborn and idealistic and completely impractical about most things. She tried to keep chickens our first winter together, despite my warnings about foxes and weasels. Lost every bird by spring, but she never stopped believing the next flock would somehow survive. Did they? Eventually. It took her 4 years to figure out proper co-op construction, but she was too proud to ask for help. I used to sneak out at night and reinforce whatever she built, then pretend to be surprised when her chickens survived. The image of the legendary Bear-Hearted secretly protecting his wife's chickens made Freya smile despite herself. It was such a perfectly ordinary kind of love, the kind that showed itself in small kindnesses rather than grand gestures. She changed. You, Freya said. She changed everything. The way I saw myself, the way I understood what strength really meant, what kind of legacy a man should leave behind. When she died, Bjorn's voice caught slightly, and he paused to move another piece before continuing. When she died, I thought that was the end of the story. But the best part of my life was over, and all that remained was waiting for the gods to call me home. Their eyes met across the chessboard, and Freya felt something shift in the space between them. Recognition that went deeper than gratitude or friendship or even attraction. For the first time since arriving at his door, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. Perhaps, she said carefully, the gods aren't finished with either of us yet. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling down through the smoke. But neither of them noticed the storm's return. They were too absorbed in studying the board between them, where carved pieces waited in patient formation for the next move in a game that had become about much more than chess. The ship model appeared. On a day when the wind had died to nothing, and the silence outside seemed to press against the walls like a living thing, Freya found Bjorn in the small alcove he used as a workshop, carefully applying oil to the rigging of what was clearly a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The vessel was perhaps 3 feet long, carved from a single piece of ash with details so precise. She could make out individual shield bosses along the gunnels and the intricate knotwork that decorated the dragon prow. Seawolf, Bjorn said without looking up from his work. My ship. I started carving her the winter after Astrid died, when the nights seemed too long to survive without something to occupy my hands. Freya moved closer, admiring the workmanship. Every detail was perfect, from the steering oar to the rolled sail lashed to its crossbeam. It was clearly the work of years, a labor of love and memory that had helped carry him through grief. She's beautiful, Freya said. How long was the real one? 92 feet from stem to stern. Room for 40 oars and crew to match. She was faster than anything else on the whale road when the wind was right. His voice carried a mixture of pride and longing. I could feel her thoughts through my hands on the steering oar. She wanted to run, always run, toward whatever horizon beckoned. You miss it. The sea, the sailing. Bjorn set down his oilcloth and turned to study her face. Do you miss being a child? The simplicity of seeing the world in terms of right and wrong, good and evil? Sometimes. The sea was like that for me. Clean, pure. Out there, survival depended on skill and courage and the favor of the gods. No politics, no complicated loyalties. Just wind and wave and the next port of call. He lifted the model, turning it to catch the light filtering through the window. In his large hands, the ship looked almost alive, ready to leap from its stand and return to the element it was born for. But that was a young man's love, he continued. Young men can afford to believe that running toward the horizon solves anything. Older men learn that some problems follow you no matter how far you sail. Freya heard the weight of experience in his words, the hard-won wisdom that came from learning life's most painful lessons. She thought of her own attempts to flee her problems, the months of running that had brought her no closer to resolution than when she'd started. Is that why you gave it up? The sailing? I gave it up because Astrid helped me understand the difference between freedom and escape. Freedom is choosing your course. Escape is letting circumstances choose it for you. They stood together in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the first birds of early spring had begun returning to the valley ravens and hawks, whose harsh cries echoed off the canyon walls. The sound reminded them both that winter's grip was loosening, that choices postponed by weather and circumstance would soon demand answers. "Spring is coming," Freya said unnecessarily. 2 months, maybe 3 before the passes are reliable. Time enough to prepare. For what? Bjorn replaced the ship model on its stand with careful precision. That depends on what you've decided to do with the rest of your life. The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither had been willing to address directly. For weeks they'd existed in a kind of suspension, their growing closeness balanced against the uncertain future that awaited beyond the valley's protection. But the returning birds were a reminder that all sanctuaries were temporary, that eventually everyone had to choose between hiding and living. "I've been thinking about what you said," Freya began carefully. "About making a stand here, using the terrain to our advantage. And I think you're right about the tactical possibilities. This valley is a fortress if properly defended. The approaches are limited, the sightlines excellent. With preparation, a small force could hold against significant numbers." Bjorn nodded but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "But I've also been thinking about the cost. Not just to us, but to you specifically. You've built something precious here. Peace, safety, a life free from the violence that wants to find you. Is it fair for me to ask you to risk that?" "You're not asking. I'm offering. Why?" The simple question carried layers of meaning, and they both knew it. Why risk everything for a stranger? Why abandon carefully constructed peace for the chaos of war? Why choose her problems over his own safety? Bjorn moved to the window, looking out over the valley that had been his sanctuary for so many years. The view was spectacular, as always, white peaks reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly, the frozen stream winding between stands of pine and birch, the small meadow where Astrid had wanted to plant an herb garden before the early frost killed her plans. "Do you know what I've learned about peace?" he said finally. "Real peace, not just the absence of conflict. Tell me, it's not a destination. It's not something you achieve and then possess forever. Peace is something you choose every day, in every decision you make. And sometimes," he turned to face her, "sometimes choosing peace means fighting for it." Freya felt her heart catch. In those words, she heard not just a tactical assessment, but something that sounded dangerously like a declaration. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling, replaced by an intimacy that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with recognition. "Bjorn, I know what you're going to say. That I'm too old, that you're too young, that circumstances make any feelings between us impossible or impractical or unfair to both of us. Am I wrong?" He moved closer, near enough that she could see the silver threads in his beard, the laugh lines around his eyes, the faint scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. "Probably not. But I've spent 8 years being practical, being careful, being safe. And in all that time, I've never felt as alive as I do when you're sitting across from me arguing about chess strategy or political theory, or the proper way to bind a wound." His hand rose to touch her face, a gesture so gentle she might have imagined it. But she could feel the calluses on his palm, the strength held carefully in check, the faint tremor that suggested he was as affected by her nearness as she was by his. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you remind me of Astrid, not because you represent some lost ideal of youth or beauty. I love you because you're brave enough to hope for better when experience has taught you to expect worse. Because you see possibilities where others see only problems. Because you make me want to be worthy of the man you seem to think I am." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her momentarily speechless. She'd hoped. Of course, it felt the growing connection between them and wondered if he felt it too. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the vulnerable certainty in his eyes, made it real in ways that hope alone could not. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, I do. But what? But loving each other doesn't solve our problems. If anything, it makes them worse. Now I have something else to lose. Something else that Grimson can use against me." Bjorn's smile was sad but determined. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." They came together without conscious decision, drawn by forces that had been building for weeks. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, the careful exploration of two people who'd learned to be wary of gifts that seemed too good to be true. But as her arms circled his neck and pulled her closer, gentleness gave way to passion long denied. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Freya rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the wool of his shirt. "This is madness," she said. "Probably. But I've tried sanity, and it's overrated." She laughed despite herself, a sound that seemed to lighten the very air around them. When had she last laughed like that freely, without calculation or fear? When had joy seemed like anything more than a memory from childhood? "The others will notice," she said. "Let them. We're not children stealing kisses in secret. We're adults making choices about our own lives. Choices that could get us all killed. Everything worthwhile carries that risk. The question is whether we're willing to live with the consequences of not choosing at all." She pulled back to look at him, seeing in his face the same mixture of hope and determination she felt in her own heart. He was right, of course. They'd reached the point where inaction was itself a choice, where safety and stagnation had become indistinguishable. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we make our stand here together, there's no going back. Win or lose, everything changes. Everything's already changed. The moment you walked into my hall, wounded and defiant and refusing to surrender, that was the moment my peaceful exile ended. Any regrets?" Bjorn's hand cupped her face again, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with infinite tenderness. "Only that it took us so long to be honest about what we both wanted." Outside, a raven called from the pine trees, its harsh cry echoing off the valley walls like a warning. But neither of them heard it. They were too absorbed in the miracle of discovered love, too amazed by the possibility that happiness might be something they deserved rather than something they'd lost forever. The ship model sat silent on its stand, a reminder of journeys undertaken and adventures past. But for the first time since carving it, Bjorn felt no longing for distant horizons. Everything he wanted was here, in this room, in this moment, in the arms of a woman brave enough to love a broken warrior back to wholeness. Some voyages, he realized, were worth making even if they led nowhere but home. The raven arrived on a morning when the first green shoots were beginning to pierce the snow in Bjorn's small garden. Freya spotted it first, a dark shape against the pale sky, circling the valley with the purposeful flight of a bird trained to specific tasks. Her face went white as understanding dawned. "Message bird," she said tersely, pointing skyward. "They found us." Bjorn emerged from the stable where he'd been tending his goats, squinting up at the circling raven. The bird was larger than the wild specimens common to the mountains, with the distinctive leg bands that marked it as one of the trained messengers, used by wealthy clans for long-distance communication. "Whose colors?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Grimson's," Freya confirmed, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Black bands on red leather. He breeds them specifically for winter flying." The raven settled on the roof of Bjorn's hall with a harsh cry that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. Even at distance, they could see the small cylinder tied to its leg, a message that represented the end of their winter sanctuary and the beginning of whatever came next. Torment emerged from the hall at the sound, followed quickly by Eric and Magnus. All three men had weapons in their hands, their earlier relaxation replaced by the hard alertness of warriors expecting battle. "How did they find us?" Eric demanded. "The passes have been closed for weeks." "Ravens don't need passes," Magnus replied grimly, "and Grimson has contacts throughout the mountain settlements. Someone must have seen our tracks before the last storm, sent word south by whatever means they could." Bjorn retrieved a long pole from beside his door and approached the bird carefully. Ravens were intelligent creatures, capable of both message carrying and reconnaissance. This one watched him with dark eyes that seemed almost human in their awareness, head tilting as if assessing his intentions. "Easy, friend," he murmured, extending the pole slowly. "Let's see what news you bring." The raven hopped onto the offered perch without resistance, allowing Bjorn to lower it close enough to remove the message cylinder. The bird showed no inclination to fly away, another troubling sign. Most message ravens were trained to return immediately after delivery, unless they'd been specifically instructed to wait for a response. The message itself was brief, but devastating. "To the woman who calls herself Freya Eric's daughter, your location is known. Your protector's reputation is noted. Neither will save you. You have until the spring thaw to surrender yourself at the Thornfield Crossing, alone and unharmed. Comply, and your remaining followers will be allowed to live. Refuse, and I will burn every settlement within 50 miles until someone delivers your head for the bounty I have placed upon it. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Even patient men have limits. Ragnar Grimson, rightful Jarl of the northern clans Freya." Read the message twice before passing it to Bjorn, her hands remarkably steady despite the color that had drained from her cheeks. "Thornfield Crossing is 2 days south of here," she said quietly. "It's where traders usually gather before attempting the mountain passes. Good ground for an ambush." "Or an execution," Tormund added bluntly. Bjorn studied the message, noting details that spoke to Grimson's character and capabilities. The writing was educated, the parchment of good quality, the wax seal elaborate enough to suggest wealth and status. But it was the content that revealed the most, particularly the casual mention of burning settlements to force compliance. "He's not bluffing about the bounty," Bjorn said finally. "A man who threatens innocent civilians to achieve his goals won't hesitate to make good on such threats." "Which means we can't simply ignore this," Freya replied. "Every day we delay, more people die because of me." "Every day we delay, we have to prepare," Magnus corrected. "My lady, you can't seriously be considering surrender, can I?" Her voice carried a brittleness that hadn't been there during their weeks of recovery. "How many innocent deaths am I worth? How many families should burn so that I can continue running from consequences I helped create?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. It was the eternal dilemma of leadership balancing personal survival against wider responsibility, weighing the lives of strangers against the principles that defined honor and courage. Bjorn crumpled the message in his fist, his expression darkening with an anger that reminded them all of why he'd once been feared across the northern seas. "You're worth as many as it takes," he said flatly. "And anyone who thinks differently doesn't understand what they're fighting for." "Pretty words," Eric said, "but sentiment won't stop 200 warriors from overrunning this valley. We're talking about defending an impossible position against overwhelming odds." "I've held impossible positions before," Bjorn replied. "The question isn't whether we can win. The question is whether we're willing to pay the price victory demands." Freya moved closer to him, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to read the future in another person's expression. "What kind of price?" "Everything. Our old lives, our comfortable assumptions about who we are and what we're capable of. If we make this stand, we stop being refugees and victims. we become something else entirely. Which is? Bjorn's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. Legends. The word carried weight that had nothing to do with glory or fame. In the context of their situation, becoming legendary meant embracing the kind of calculated violence that created stories told for generations. The kind that separated heroes from ordinary people through acts of such audacious courage that they seemed impossible. In retrospect, you have a plan, Freya said. It wasn't a question. I have the beginning of one, but it depends on information I don't yet possess. He turned to address her guards. How many men can Grimson field immediately? Not his total strength, but how many can he bring to bear on short notice? Tormund considered carefully before answering. 60, maybe 70. His core warband, the men who've been with him longest. The rest are scattered across a dozen holdings, maintaining order in newly conquered territories. And how many of those 70 know this terrain? None, Eric replied immediately. Grimson's power base is in the lowlands. His men are raiders and siege specialists, not mountain fighters. Bjorn nodded, pieces of a larger strategy beginning to form in his mind. What about supply lines? How do they provision themselves for extended campaigns? Carefully, Magnus answered. Grimson's no fool. He learned from watching other Jarls make mistakes. His men carry minimal gear and live off the land when possible. But they maintain supply caches at strategic points along their routes, including the approach to this valley. There's a cache at Elkridge, half a day's march south. Standard stores dried meat, ale, replacement weapons. Enough to support a raiding party for a week. The information confirmed what Bjorn had suspected. Grimson was indeed a competent commander, but he was also predictable, a man who relied on conventional tactics and overwhelming force rather than innovation or adaptability. That predictability could be exploited by someone willing to think beyond traditional warfare. The message mentioned a deadline, Freya pointed out. Spring thaw could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on weather. Then we use that uncertainty, Bjorn replied. Grimson expects either immediate surrender or prolonged delay. He's not prepared for the third option, which is, we go to him first. The silence that followed was profound. Even the raven seemed to sense the shift in mood, ruffling its feathers and eyeing the humans with increased wariness. That's madness, Tormund said finally. It's tactics, Bjorn corrected. Grimson has positioned himself to respond to our choices, not to make his own. He's reactive, waiting for us to either run or hide or surrender. But what if we do none of those things? What if we take the initiative away from him entirely? Freya's eyes were bright with understanding and something that might have been admiration. You want to attack his supply cache. I want to eliminate his ability to sustain a siege. No supplies means no extended campaign. No extended campaign means he has to either withdraw or commit to a single decisive assault on ground of our choosing. And if he chooses the assault? Bjorn's smile was grim but confident. Then we'll be ready for him. This valley has advantages he can't imagine, and we have something his men lack. What's that? A reason to fight that goes beyond money or glory or fear of their commander. We're fighting for each other, for the possibility of a future worth having. That kind of motivation makes ordinary people capable of extraordinary things. The raven chose that moment to take flight, launching itself from the roof with a harsh cry that echoed off the valley walls. They watched it circle once before heading south, carrying word back to its master that the message had been delivered and received. No going back now, Magnus observed. There was never any going back, Freya replied. The moment I chose to stop running, the moment Bjorn chose to stand with me, that was when our old lives ended. She moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his with the naturalness of settled affection. When do we leave? Tomorrow night. Moving under cover of darkness, traveling light and fast. We'll hit the cache at dawn, eliminate any guards, and be back here before Grimson realizes what's happened. And then? Bjorn looked around at the valley that had been his sanctuary for so many years, at the simple hall where he'd found peace and love and purpose. All of it would be at risk in the days ahead, but he felt no regret, only a fierce anticipation. That reminded him of his youth. Then, we prepare to give Ragnar Grimson the kind of welcome that gets remembered in songs. The plan that took shape over the following hours was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Success would cripple Grimson's immediate offensive capabilities and force him into the kind of hasty assault that favored defenders. Failure would mean death or capture for the raiders, leaving the valley defenseless against inevitable retaliation. But as they worked through the details, routes, timing, contingencies, none of them spoke of failure. They had moved beyond such mundane concerns into the realm where legends were born, where ordinary people discovered they were capable of changing the world through will and courage and love. Outside, the first ravens of spring were returning to their ancient nesting grounds, their harsh calls echoing off the mountains like war cries. Change was coming to the peaceful valley, but for the first time in months, its defenders were ready to meet it head-on. The raid on Elk Ridge took place under a starless sky, with clouds so thick they seemed to press down on the mountains like a gray woolen blanket. Bjorn led the way through terrain he'd mapped in his mind during long winter evenings, his feet finding purchase on rock and root with the confidence of absolute familiarity. Behind him moved Freya and her 3 guards, all of them armed and moving with the fluid silence of predators approaching prey. They'd left Magnus behind to watch the valley, a decision that had sparked heated debate until Bjorn pointed out that someone needed to maintain their defenses in case the raid went badly. The big man had accepted the assignment with obvious reluctance, understanding the necessity while hating the exclusion from what might be their most crucial operation. The supply cache was exactly where Magnus had described it, a series of hidden caves in a limestone ridge that overlooked the southern approach to Burns Valley. Grimson's men had chosen the location well, defensible, concealed, and positioned to support multiple lines of advance through the mountain passes. Under normal circumstances, it would have been nearly impregnable, but these weren't normal circumstances. Bjorn had spent 20 years learning every secret the mountains held, and he knew ways into the ridge that its current occupants couldn't imagine. More importantly, he understood something about night fighting that most warriors never learned. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, but a weapon that could be wielded by those patient enough to master its use. 6 guards, Eric whispered, having completed his reconnaissance of the cache's approaches. 2 at the main entrance, 2 more at what looks like a back way-in. The other 2 are probably sleeping inside. Shift changes? Bjorn asked. Every 4 hours, like clockwork. Professional setup, these aren't just thugs with axes. Bjorn nodded grimly. He'd expected as much. Grimson hadn't built his reputation by employing careless men, and the guards he'd assigned to such a crucial supply point would be veterans capable of reacting quickly to unexpected threats. How do you want to handle this? Tormund asked. The question was directed at Bjorn, an acknowledgement of his tactical authority that would have surprised many who knew only the peaceful hermit he'd become. But here, in the darkness before battle, the old instincts had reasserted themselves with frightening clarity. His mind worked through possibilities with the cold precision that had once made him legendary. Freya and I take the back entrance, he said finally. You and Eric eliminate the front guards simultaneously. No sound, no warning. Once the perimeter is clear, we move inside together. And if we encounter resistance, we end it quickly. These men chose to serve a cause that threatens innocent people. They forfeited any claim to mercy. The words came out harder than he'd intended, colored by an anger that went deeper than tactical necessity. These weren't just enemy soldiers, they were the instruments of a man who'd threatened to burn settlements full of families to satisfy his ambition. The moral mathematics were simple and brutal. Freya touched his arm gently, drawing his attention. "Are you all right?" "I'm remembering things I thought I'd forgotten. Skills I hope never to need again. Any regrets?" Bjorn considered the question. Seriously, did he regret the necessity of violence? Yes. Did he regret having the capability to protect what mattered to him? Not for a moment. "Ask me again when this is over," he said. They separated into their assigned pairs, moving through the darkness with careful precision. Bjorn led Freya up a narrow game trail that wound around the back of the ridge, his knowledge of the terrain allowing them to navigate by touch and memory alone. The back entrance was little more than a crack in the rock face, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The guards there were good alert, positioned to cover the most likely approaches, weapons ready for immediate use. But they were thinking like conventional soldiers, watching for enemies who would announce themselves with noise and obvious movement. They weren't prepared for an aging Viking who'd learned stealth from Irish monks before he'd burned their monastery, or for a clan daughter who'd survived 5 years of warfare by mastering the art of moving unseen. Bjorn's knife found the first guard's throat before the man could draw breath to shout. Freya's blade, the small dagger she'd kept hidden for so long, silenced the second with surgical precision. Both men died without sound, their bodies lowered carefully to prevent any noise that might alert their companions. The entrance led into a natural cavern that had been enlarged and reinforced to create proper storage space. Supplies were stacked with military efficiency barrels of ale and preserved meat, racks of weapons, bundles of arrows, bags of grain. That would keep an army fed for weeks. The wealth represented here spoke to Grimson's resources and organizational capabilities, but it also represented his vulnerability. An army without supplies was just a mob of hungry men with weapons. They waited in the darkness near the cave mouth, listening for sounds that would indicate their companions had succeeded with the front guards. When the soft whistle came, Eric signaled that the perimeter was clear. They moved deeper into the cache. The remaining guards were asleep in a side chamber, wrapped in good wool blankets and dreaming of whatever comforts they'd left behind. Bjorn felt a moment's regret for what came next. These men had done nothing to earn death beyond choosing the wrong employer, but necessity overrode sentiment. War was a mathematics of survival, and mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. The work was quick and quiet. When Tormund and Eric appeared at the main entrance, they found Bjorn and Freya already beginning the systematic destruction of everything valuable the cache contained. "No survivors," Tormund observed, noting the bodies. "No witnesses," Bjorn corrected. "Grimson will know we were here soon enough, but I want him guessing about our capabilities as long as possible." They worked through the remaining hours of darkness, destroying what they couldn't carry and carrying what would be most useful in the battles ahead. Weapons were examined and selected. The best went into their packs. The rest were rendered useless with broken points and severed strings. Food supplies were contaminated with substances that would make them unpalatable, but not obviously poisoned. A trick Bjorn had learned during siege warfare against cities that relied on stored provisions. But it was the intelligence they discovered that proved most valuable. Hidden in the cache's main chamber was a leather satchel containing maps, message copies, and supply manifests that revealed the full scope of Grimson's campaign. His forces were larger than they'd estimated, nearly 300 men scattered across the mountain approaches, with more arriving from his southern holdings as weather permitted. "He's not just hunting you," Bjorn said, as they studied the documents by torchlight. "He's planning a complete occupation of this entire region. Your capture is just the beginning." Freya read over his shoulder, her face grim in the flickering light. "Look at this supply requisitions for 6 months, not 6 weeks. And these troop dispositions, he's planning to establish permanent garrisons in every major settlement." "Which means negotiation isn't possible," Eric said quietly. "Even if you surrendered, he'd continue the campaign. This stopped being about clan warfare the moment he decided to become a conqueror. The revelation changed everything. What they'd thought was a personal vendetta was actually the opening move in a larger strategy that would bring decades of warfare to the previously peaceful mountain communities. Grimson wasn't just their enemy, he was a threat to everyone who called these peaks home. "We need to warn the settlements," Freya said. "We need to survive the next few days first," Bjorn replied practically. "But yes, if we can hold him here, break his momentum, word will spread. Other clans will have time to prepare, to form alliances. Sometimes stopping one ambitious man is enough to prevent a war." They finished their work as dawn approached, loading the captured supplies onto pack frames and preparing for the difficult journey back to Born's Valley. The raid had been more successful than they dared hope. Not only had they crippled Grimson's immediate offensive capabilities, but they had gained intelligence that would help them prepare for what was coming. But as they prepared to leave the destroyed cache, Bjorn felt the weight of what they'd accomplished settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. 6 men were dead by their hands, their blood the price of tactical advantage. The peaceful hermit who'd welcomed travelers and mended fences was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "Second thoughts?" Freya asked, noting his expression. "Just wondering if the man I'm becoming is someone Astrid would recognize." "Do you think she'd disapprove?" Bjorn considered the question as they began their descent from the ridge. What would his wife think of the violence he'd embraced, the calculated brutality that had once again become part of his nature? But as he thought about it, he remembered her words during the darker moments of their life together, her understanding that sometimes good people had to do terrible things to protect what mattered. She'd understand, he said finally. She always understood that strength without purpose was just cruelty. The purpose without strength was just wishful thinking. They made good time on the return journey, reaching the valley as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Magnus met them at the tree line, his relief at their safe return evident despite his attempts to maintain stoic composure. "Success?" he asked. "Complete," Bjorn replied. "But now the real work begins." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation that transformed Bjorn's peaceful valley into something resembling a military fortress. Using techniques learned during decades of siege warfare, they identified choke points, established firing positions, and created defensive obstacles that would channel attacking forces into killing zones where superior numbers would become disadvantages. Bjorn's battle plans covered sheets of bark with diagrams that looked like the work of a military engineer rather than a simple hermit. Each drawing showed precise positioning for defenders, optimal angles of fire, and contingency routes for withdrawal if positions became untenable. The strategic mind that had once terrorized the northern seas was fully engaged, planning not just for victory, but for the kind of decisive defeat that would end Grimson's ambitions permanently. "You're not just planning to survive this," Freya observed, studying the intricate diagrams. "You're planning to win so completely that no one will ever threaten this valley again." "Exactly," Bjorn replied. "Half measures in warfare are how good. People die while bad people escape to cause more trouble. If Grimson wants to test himself against the Bear-Hearted, he's going to get the full experience." The painted shields they'd found in the destroyed cache had been repurposed into a defensive formation that would have impressed professional soldiers. Arranged in overlapping positions along the valley's main approach, they created a shield wall that could absorb and redirect the momentum of a charging force while protecting the defenders behind it. "Your ancestors would be proud," Tormund said, helping position the final shield. This is how warriors fought in the old days, when honor meant something more than personal glory. My ancestors were pirates and murderers, Bjorn replied without emotion. But they understood that some things are worth dying for, and even more worth killing for. On the evening before they expected Grimson's arrival, Bjorn found himself alone with Freya in the hall that had been their sanctuary. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls that might soon echo with the sounds of battle. Everything they built together, the growing love, the plans for a future, the simple joy of shared companionship, hung in the balance of the next day's violence. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of dying. I've been ready for that since Astrid passed. But of failing you, of watching everything we found together get destroyed because I wasn't skilled enough or strong enough or clever enough to protect it. And if I said we could still run? Disappear into the deep mountains until Grimson gives up and turns his attention elsewhere?" Bjorn smiled, pulling her closer to him in the firelight. "I'd say you were testing me. The woman I fell in love with doesn't run from fights that matter, and this one matters more than any either of us has ever faced. You're right. I was testing you. Did I pass? With honors." They held each other in the dancing firelight, listening to the wind outside and the distant sounds of their companions making final preparations. Tomorrow would bring violence and pain and the possibility of death. But tonight was theirs a moment of peace before the storm, a chance to hold tight to what they'd found together before risking it all for the chance to keep it forever. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Freya whispered, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. Not despite the danger, but because of what we've meant to each other in spite of it." "Then we've already won," Bjorn replied. "Everything else is just details." Outside, the first scouts of Grimson's army were beginning to probe the valleys. Outer approaches, their torches visible as distant points of light moving through the darkness. The time for preparation was ending. Soon, the legend of Bear-Hearted would be tested one final time, in a battle that would determine not just their survival, but the fate of everyone who called the mountains home. Dawn came gray and cold, with wisps of fog clinging to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping spirits. Bjorn stood at the window of his hall, watching the mist swirl around the defensive positions they'd spent days perfecting. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, Grimson's army was preparing for an assault that would determine everything. The shield wall formation they'd created stretched across the valley's narrowest point, a barrier of painted wood and iron that had been positioned with mathematical precision. Each shield overlapped its neighbors by exactly the right amount to deflect spear thrusts while maintaining structural integrity. Behind the wall, carefully concealed firing positions offered clear sight lines down the approach routes while providing protection from return fire. "They're moving," Eric called softly from his position near the main entrance. Through the lifting fog, the first elements of Grimson's force became visible. They advanced in good order, no wild charge of undisciplined raiders, but the measured approach of professional soldiers who understood the value of tactical patience. Bjorn counted perhaps 60 men in the initial assault wave, with more visible in reserve positions further up the valley's approach. "Grimson's not leading from the front," Tormund observed, studying the enemy formation through a gap in the shutters. "Smart man, he's letting his subordinates test our defenses first." Bjorn nodded grimly. It was what he'd expected from a competent commander. Grimson would probe their positions, identify weaknesses, then commit his main force where it could do the most damage. The shield wall would face its first test against troops whose job was to die, learning its limitations. "Remember," he said quietly to his companions, "they have to come to us. Every step they take up this valley puts them further from support and deeper into ground we control. Patience wins this kind of fight, not heroics." The enemy advance halted just outside effective arrow range, close enough to study the defensive positions but far enough away to avoid immediate casualties. A single figure rode forward from their ranks, a man in fine mail who carried himself with the authority of long command. Even at distance, his voice carried clearly in the still mountain air. "Bjorn called Bear-Hearted," he shouted. "I am Hakon, One-Eye, sworn man to Ragnar Grimson. My lord offers terms for the woman you harbor." Bjorn stepped outside his hall, making himself visible but staying well within the protection of his defenses. "I'm listening. Surrender the traitor Freya, and you and your household will be allowed to depart unharmed. Refuse, and we'll take her anyway, along with your head as proof that even legends have limits." The offer was expected, though Bjorn noted the careful wording. Grimson was still hoping to avoid the kind of costly assault that would weaken his forces for future campaigns. But the threat was real enough. These men had come prepared for serious fighting, and their leader was confident enough to demand unconditional surrender. "Counteroffer," Bjorn called back. "Take your men and leave my valley. Do that, and I won't have to explain to your wives why their husbands chose to die in a ditch so far from home." Laughter rippled through the enemy ranks, though it carried an edge of uncertainty. The Bear-Hearted's reputation was legend, but legends could be exaggerated. The reality would be tested soon enough. Hakon One-Eye raised his sword, its blade catching the weak sunlight like a signal. "So be it. You've chosen death over wisdom." He wheeled his horse and galloped back to his lines, leaving behind only the sound of wind through pine trees and the distant murmur of men preparing for battle. The brief negotiation had been theater, both sides going through the forms while knowing that words would never resolve what they'd come here to settle. "Arrows first," Bjorn said, taking his position behind the central section of the shield wall. "Let them taste what climbing this valley costs before they get close enough to test our line." The enemy formation shifted, professional soldiers arranging themselves for an assault that would test every aspect of their defensive preparations. Bjorn felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the slow burn of anticipation that he'd thought was buried with his raiding days. But instead of the wild berserker rage of his youth, this was something colder and more controlled, the calculated fury of a man fighting to protect everything that mattered to him. Freya took her position beside him, her own bow strung and ready. She'd proven surprisingly skilled during their practice sessions, her noble upbringing having included the kind of military training that prepared clan daughters for the realities of a violent world. "Any final words of wisdom?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Bjorn replied, watching the enemy archers take their positions. "When this starts, everything happens fast. Don't think, just react. Trust your training, trust your companions, and remember that we're fighting for the right to grow old together." The first enemy arrows began to fall like deadly rain, their points sparking off stone and shield wood with sounds like hammer blows on an anvil. But the defensive positions held, and return fire began to thin the advancing ranks with precision that spoke to superior knowledge of range and trajectory. The real battle was about to begin. The shield wall held through the first assault like a dam against a flood, but Bjorn could feel the strain in every timber and binding. Grimson's men had thrown themselves against the defensive line with professional determination, their axes and spears seeking gaps that existed only in theory. Bodies lay crumpled before the barrier, testimony to the cost of testing a position designed by someone who understood both attack and defense with equal intimacy. "They're regrouping," Eric called from his position on the left flank, blood running from a cut above his eye where a spear point had found the gap between his helmet and shield rim. Bjorn nodded grimly, watching the enemy pull back to reform their ranks. The first assault had been reconnaissance in force, a probe designed to identify weaknesses and test the defender's resolve. Now Grimson himself rode forward, his presence marked by the Blood Eagle standard that snapped in the mountain wind. Like a crimson promise of death, Ragnar Grimson was everything Bjorn had expected: tall, broad-shouldered, carrying himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to victory. His mail was fine work, his weapons of the quality that spoke to wealth and status. But it was his eyes that revealed the most cold, calculating, utterly without mercy or doubt. "Bear-Hearted!" Grimson's voice carried the authority of absolute command. "You fight well for an old man playing at being a farmer. But this charade ends now." Instead of responding to the taunt, Bjorn studied the enemy formation with professional interest. Grimson had committed nearly his entire force to this assault, perhaps 150 men arrayed in a wedge formation designed to punch through the shield wall center. It was good tactics, concentrating maximum force at the point of decision. It was also exactly what Bjorn had been hoping for. "On my signal," he said quietly to his companions. "Remember, we're not trying to hold this position forever. We're trying to make them pay such a price for taking it that they'll never recover." The second assault came with the disciplined fury of veterans who'd learned to channel berserker rage into tactical advantage. But as the enemy wedge struck the shield wall center, Bjorn triggered the trap he'd spent days preparing. Hidden rope lines pulled tight, and sections of the valley floor gave way to reveal concealed pits lined with sharpened stakes. Men screamed as they fell, their momentum carrying them onto points that had been positioned with surgical precision. "Now!" Bjorn roared. The shield wall center collapsed deliberately, sections falling back in controlled retreat that drew the surviving attackers into a killing ground where every position had been calculated for maximum effect. Arrows from concealed positions flanked the enemy advance, while carefully placed obstacles channeled their movement into predetermined zones of death. But Grimson's men were professionals, and they adapted quickly to the changed circumstances. Instead of pursuing the retreating center, they spread out to attack the defensive positions from multiple angles. What had been a coordinated assault became a dozen smaller battles fought with desperate intensity across the narrow valley floor. Bjorn found himself face to face with Hakon One Eye, the enemy commander's scarred features twisted with battle fury. The man was skilled. His sword work spoke of decades of experience, but he was thinking like a young warrior, relying on strength and aggression rather than patience and precision. "You should have taken the terms," Hakon snarled, pressing his attack with renewed vigor. "I'm too old to start making bad decisions now," Bjorn replied, his own blade turning aside a thrust that would have opened his throat. The duel was brief but decisive. Hakon's youth and strength were advantages, but Bjorn's experience and superior positioning proved decisive. A feint to the left followed by a cut from an impossible angle, and Hakon One Eye lived up to his name permanently. But even as their commander fell, Grimson's men continued to press their attack with the kind of disciplined fury that marked truly professional soldiers. They'd taken grievous casualties, but they'd also breached the main defensive line. Now the battle became a series of individual combats, fought among the rocks and trees of Bjorn's carefully prepared positions. Freya moved through the chaos with deadly grace, her small size and speed allowing her to strike where larger opponents couldn't follow. The hidden dagger that had represented her secret capabilities was now revealed in its full purpose, not just a weapon of last resort, but the tool of someone trained from childhood in the arts of survival. Magnus fought like his namesake stone, unmovable and implacable, his massive frame anchoring a defensive position that three men couldn't dislodge. Tormund's experience showed in every movement, the old warrior conserving energy while making each strike count with surgical precision. But it was Grimson himself who presented the greatest threat. The enemy Jarl had dismounted and was cutting his way through the defensive positions with the kind of controlled savagery that had built his reputation. His sword was a masterwork, its blade singing as it clove through shield wood and mail with equal ease. "Face me, Bear-Hearted," he called, stepping over the bodies of fallen defenders. Let's settle this between men, not hide behind walls and tricks. The challenge was both tactical and personal. Grimson understood that defeating Bjorn in single combat would break the defender's morale more effectively than any number of tactical victories. But as Bjorn moved to accept the challenge, he felt a strange sense of completion rather than fear. This was what everything had been leading to, not just the battle, but the entire arc of his life. The young raider who'd terrorized distant shores. The man who'd found love and redemption. The hermit who'd discovered that some things were worth fighting for. All of it had prepared him for this moment. The blood eagle. Standard snapped overhead like a crimson curse. But Bjorn no longer saw it as a symbol of his enemy's power. Instead, he saw it as a reminder of everything he'd rejected, everything he'd chosen to stand against. Some battles were about more than victory or defeat. They were about who you chose to become, when everything you valued hung in the balance. The final confrontation was about to begin. The duel between Bjorn and Grimson lasted only minutes, but those minutes contained the essence of everything that separated them. Grimson fought with the cruel efficiency of a man who saw other people as obstacles to his ambition. Bjorn fought with the careful precision of someone defending everything he'd learned to love. In the end, it was experience that proved decisive. Grimson was younger, stronger, driven by the kind of hunger that had once motivated Bjorn himself. But hunger wasn't wisdom, and ambition wasn't the same as purpose. When the moment came, when Grimson overextended himself in pursuit of a killing, Bjorn's counterstrike was as inevitable as winter following autumn. The enemy Jarl fell among the scattered stones of the valley floor, his blood eagle standard falling beside him like a collapsed dream of conquest. With their leader dead and their assault broken, Grimson's surviving men began the long retreat toward whatever futures awaited them beyond the mountain passes. The victory was complete, but its cost became apparent as the immediate adrenaline of battle faded. Bodies lay scattered across the defensive positions, testament to the price of stopping an army bent on conquest. Magnus had taken a spear thrust to the shoulder that would trouble him for the rest of his life. Eric bore cuts that would leave scars to match his older companions. Tormund had fought his last battle with the same steady competence that had marked all the others. But it was Bjorn who paid the heaviest price. Grimson's final blow had found its mark, a sword thrust between the ribs that had missed his heart by the width of a blade. He'd fought on for precious minutes after taking the wound, but now the adrenaline was fading and blood loss was beginning to take its toll. How bad? Freya asked, helping him settle against a boulder where he could watch the sun set over his valley one last time. Bad enough, he replied honestly. The blade found something important, and I'm too old to recover from this kind of damage. She pressed clean linen against the wound, but they both knew it was too late for healing. This wasn't the kind of injury that responded to herbs and patience. It was the kind that marked the end of stories rather than their continuation. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. This is my fault. If you hadn't come here, I'd have died anyway. Bjorn interrupted gently. Probably alone, probably forgotten. Certainly without knowing what it felt like to love someone again. You gave me something I thought was lost forever. The sun was settling behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the very air on fire. It was beautiful in a way that made the approaching darkness seem less frightening, more like a natural conclusion to a day well lived. Tell me what you see, Bjorn said softly. Freya looked around the valley that had become their sanctuary, their fortress, their home. I see peace, she said finally. Not just the absence of war, but the presence of something better. I see a place where people like us can build something worth defending. Good. That's what I wanted to build here. That's what we fought to protect. They sat together as darkness gathered around them, holding hands like young lovers despite the blood and weariness and approaching separation. In the distance, they could hear the surviving defenders tending their wounded and beginning the work of burial that followed every battle. Life would continue, carrying forward the possibilities they'd protected. "What happens now?" Freya asked. "Now you live," Bjorn replied. "You take what we've built here and make it into something even better. You find ways to help other people discover what we found together. You prove that love can be stronger than ambition, that building can matter more than destroying. Without you, I'll be with you in every choice you make, every kindness you show, every moment when you choose hope over fear. The best parts of what we found together, those don't die with me." As if summoned by his words, Magnus appeared carrying something wrapped in soft leather. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a piece of stone, freshly carved with symbols and words that caught. "The last light of evening. I started this when we knew the battle was coming," he said quietly. "Thought it might be needed, one way or another." The memorial stone was simple but beautiful, carved with runes that spelled out Bjorn's name and the dates that bracketed his time in the valley. But it was the inscription at the bottom that brought fresh tears to Freya's eyes. He chose love over legend and found both. "It's perfect," she said. The stars were coming out now, brilliant points of light in the clear mountain air. Bjorn recognized the constellations that had guided him across distant seas in his youth: Odin's wagon, the Wolf's eyes, the Swan's path that marked the way home for travelers lost in darkness. "I can see them," he whispered, his voice growing weaker. "All of them. Astrid, my parents, the good men who died in my service, they're waiting." Freya held his hand tighter, as if she could anchor him to the world through will alone. "I love you," she said. "I love you too. More than life, more than legend, more than anything I ever thought possible." His breathing grew shallow, peaceful, like a man settling into the most restful sleep of his life. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll be happy. Not just content, not just surviving, but truly happy. Promise me you'll find reasons to laugh, to dance, to wake up grateful for another day. I promise." Bjorn smiled one last time, his weathered features relaxing into the expression of a man who'd found everything he'd been searching for. "Then, I've lived a complete life." He died as he'd requested, in peace, in love, surrounded by people who understood what he'd accomplished and what it had cost. The legendary Bear-Hearted was gone, but the man who'd chosen love over loneliness, hope over bitterness, building over destruction, that man's legacy would endure in the hearts of everyone he'd touched. Years later, travelers to the valley would find Freya tending a small garden beside a memorial stone that weathered but never crumbled. She'd grown old gracefully, surrounded by the family she'd built from the survivors of that long-ago battle and the refugees who found their way to the sanctuary she maintained. But on quiet evenings, when the sun set behind the western peaks and the stars came out in their ancient patterns, she would sit beside the stone and remember a winter when love had proven stronger than fear, when two broken people had discovered they could heal each other, when an aging warrior had shown that the greatest victories weren't won with swords, but with the courage to hope for something better. Sometimes the greatest love stories do begin in the quiet autumn of life, when weathered hearts recognize something sacred in each other. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, they never really end at all.